It began on a chilly autumn morning. I had just purchased an old Victorian house on the outskirts of a quiet New England town. It was the kind of house that looked picturesque in photos, but seemed to breathe with its own unsettling energy when you stood before it. The realtor had called it charming. I called it a bargain. But deep down, I wondered why it had stayed on the market for so long. The house was enormous, too big for a single guy like me, but I was eager to start fresh after my divorce. The creaking wooden floors and the faint smell of dust, mixed with dampness, gave it character, or so I told myself. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and trying to ignore the occasional drafts that seemed to sneak in through invisible cracks. By the fourth night, I started noticing things. It began subtly, a tapping sound near the walls that I attributed to an old house settling. Then there was the faint sound of footsteps in the attic, though I hadn't ventured up there yet. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the unease began to creep into my bones. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft whisper. It wasn't clear words, more like a raspy breath brushing against my ears. My body froze, every hair standing on end. I turned on the bedside lamp, the light flooding the room, but nothing was there. The next morning, I told myself I was just tired and stressed from the move. Yet as I walked downstairs for breakfast, I noticed the door to the basement slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it the night before. My heart raced as I approached the door, the air around it feeling colder than the rest of the house. I peered down the dark stairs but saw nothing. Still, I shut the door firmly and decided to keep it locked from then on. The whispers, however, didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder each night. They began to form words, though they were fragmented and incoherent. Help, stay, why, they seemed to say. It felt as though the house was trying to communicate with me, and despite my mounting fear, a morbid curiosity began to take hold. I decided to explore the attic the following day, thinking I might find some explanation, perhaps rodents, or some loose insulation causing the strange sounds. But what I found was far more unsettling. The attic was exactly what you'd expect from an old house, dark, cramped, and heavy with the smell of aged wood and dust. I climbed the rickety stairs with a flashlight in hand, each step groaning under my weight. As the light swept across the room, I noticed the usual assortment of forgotten relics, old trunks, broken furniture, and yellowed newspapers. But something caught my eye. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by a pile of discarded blankets, was a small wooden chest. It was unlike anything else in the attic. Polished, intricate carvings adorned its edges, and a faint smell of lavender wafted from it. I knelt down, brushing off the dust. My fingers trembled as I opened the lid. Inside, I found a collection of what looked like personal belongings. An antique hand mirror, a comb with strands of hair still caught in its teeth, and a leather-bound diary. The diary was the most peculiar item. Its cover was cracked and worn, and when I opened it, I saw that the pages were filled with spidery handwriting. The entries dated back to the late 1800s. I skimmed through the first few pages where a woman named Eleanor described her life in the house. At first, the entries were mundane, detailing her daily routines and thoughts about her husband. But as I flipped further, the tone shifted. Eleanor began writing about strange occurrences in the house, voices that called to her in the night, objects moving on their own, and shadows that seemed to creep along the walls. My stomach twisted as I read her final entry. It was hurried, the handwriting jagged and desperate. "They're angry," she wrote. "They want something. They won't let me leave." A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the diary shut and shoved it back into the chest, feeling as though I had intruded on something I wasn't meant to see. As I turned to leave the attic, my flashlight flickered and the room was plunged into near darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled to tap the flashlight back on. In that brief moment of darkness, I heard a sound, a low, guttural moan, almost like a voice but far too distorted to be human. The flashlight flickered back to life, and I whipped around, the beam of light darting across the attic. There was nothing there, yet the air felt heavier, oppressive, as if the house itself were bearing down on me. I stumbled down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it, vowing never to go up there again. But deep down, I knew whatever had been in that attic was now fully aware of me. That night, the whispers turned into something worse. That night, the house became a living, breathing thing. The whispers no longer confined themselves to the edges of my hearing. They filled the air around me, echoing like faint cries in a tunnel. The words were clearer now. "Why, stay, help us." The voices overlapped, as though there were many of them speaking at once. I stayed in my bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with every light in the room turned on. My heart was pounding as I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of exhaustion or stress. But deep down, I knew better. As the clock ticked past midnight, the air in the room grew colder. It wasn't just a draft, it was a bone-deep chill that made my breath visible. The light in the room dimmed slightly as though the house was siphoning energy from everything around it. Then I saw it. It began as a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the wall where no shadow should be. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. My pulse quickened, and I clutched my phone, considering calling someone, anyone, just to feel less alone. Before I could act, the shadow returned. This time, it wasn't fleeting. It lingered on the far wall, shifting and writhing like a living thing. It wasn't cast by any object in the room, and its movements didn't match the natural flow of light and darkness. I stood frozen, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The shadow grew larger, stretching across the wall until it seemed to consume the entire space. My bedroom lights began to flicker violently, plunging me into alternating darkness and dim light. The whispers became louder, more insistent. "He knows. We are here. Don't ignore us." Then the shadow moved. It detached itself from the wall, shifting across the floor toward me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed. The shadow stopped just short of my feet, and for a moment the room fell completely silent. In the stillness, I felt a pressure building in my chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. The whispers turned into a single, guttural voice that spoke directly into my mind. "You opened the door." The lights in the room surged back on, banishing the shadow, but the feeling of dread lingered. I grabbed my car keys and fled the house without a second thought, driving aimlessly through the night, trying to escape the oppressive fear that clung to me. When I finally returned hours later, the house was eerily quiet, but as I stepped inside, I noticed something new. The basement door was wide open even though I had locked it. The sight of the basement door hanging open made my skin crawl. I had locked that door, no question about it. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring into the yawning darkness below. The air around the door seemed colder, almost as if it were leaking something otherworldly into the house. A voice inside me screamed to leave, to get back in my car and never return. But there was another voice, a quieter, darker curiosity that whispered, "You need to know." Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. Each step down the basement stairs felt heavier than the last, as though an invisible force were trying to pull me back. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating cobwebs and old wooden beams. The basement smelled of damp earth and decay, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something strange. The far wall, which I had assumed was solid stone, had a small wooden door embedded within it. It was old, with rusted hinges and a warped frame, as though it had been there for decades, untouched. The sight of it filled me with dread, but I couldn't look away. I approached the door, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. When I reached for the handle, I hesitated. The metal was ice cold under my fingertips. For a moment, I thought about going back upstairs, pretending I hadn't seen it. But then, as if compelled by some unseen force, I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with the smell of something long dead. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, but as I stepped inside, I saw the outlines of symbols etched into the walls, intricate, unfamiliar markings that seemed to pulsate faintly, as though they were alive. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me in a cacophony of fragmented voices. "Why did you come? Help us! Stay away!" The words overlapped, blending into a horrifying symphony that made my head pound. I ventured deeper into the passage, the walls closing in around me. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, like stepping on bones or brittle wood. I shone the flashlight ahead and saw something that made my stomach churn. A pile of old, rotting furniture and what looked like broken toys. Among the debris I spotted a small, tarnished locket. It seemed out of place, too personal to belong in this forsaken space. When I picked it up, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving me in oppressive silence. I opened the locket and found a faded photo of a woman and a child. The woman looked familiar. Her face matched the description of Eleanor from the diary I'd found in the attic. Before I could process what I'd seen, the ground beneath me trembled. A low rumble echoed through the passage, and the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, clutching the locket tightly. Then I heard it, a growl, low and guttural, reverberating through the passage. It wasn't human, and it wasn't natural. The glow from the symbols grew brighter, casting an eerie light on the walls. I turned and ran, the whispers returning as a deafening roar in my ears. When I reached the basement stairs, I felt something brush against my ankle, a cold, slimy touch that made me scream. I stumbled up the steps, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My chest heaved as I locked it again, this time barricading it with a heavy chair. But I knew it wasn't enough. Whatever I had disturbed in the basement wasn't going to stay there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, clutching the locket and staring at the basement door. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows, sent my heart racing. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As dawn broke, I decided to confront the one remaining mystery. The diary. If Eleanor had lived through this, perhaps her words held a clue. I retrieved the diary from the attic chest and sat at the kitchen table, flipping to the pages I had skipped. The entries painted a horrifying picture. Eleanor wrote of how her husband had discovered the passage in the basement and had been obsessed with it, claiming it was a gateway to something he called the truth. She described how he spent hours down there, carving symbols into the walls and muttering incantations in a language she didn't understand. Then came the final entries, darker and more frantic than the rest. Eleanor described how her husband began to change, his body wasting away as though something was draining him. She wrote of seeing shadows that moved on their own, and of hearing voices that spoke in her husband's voice, even when he wasn't home. Her last entry read, "He's opened the door, and now it won't close. They've taken him. They want me next. I hear them in the walls calling my name. I pray for forgiveness, but I fear it's too late." I closed the diary, my hands trembling. Whatever her husband had unleashed was still here, festering in the walls, waiting for another victim. My thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from the basement door. My body seized with fear as I turned toward the sound. The barricade had been pushed aside, the door swinging open on its own. Cold air spilled out, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. I stumbled backward, the locket slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct. "You brought this. You woke us. Stay with us." The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, but no one appeared. Instead, the shadows began to pour into the room, coalescing into a form that was vaguely human, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its face a shifting mass of darkness with glowing, empty eyes. I tried to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The shadow moved toward me, reaching out with an arm that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My vision blurred, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, as though it were trying to pull something out of me. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed the locket and held it up. The shadow recoiled, its form rippling as if in pain. The whispers turned to shrieks, and the house itself seemed to shudder. I don't know why, but the locket seemed to hold some kind of power over it, a tether to Eleanor's suffering. With all the strength I had left, I hurled the locket toward the basement. As it crossed the threshold, the shadow dissolved into a swirling mass and was sucked back down the stairs. The basement door slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the house fell silent once more. I didn't stay long after that. I packed whatever I could carry and left the house behind, vowing never to return. But even now, in the quiet of my new apartment, I sometimes hear faint whispers at night, and I can't shake the feeling that I left something unfinished, that the house is still waiting for someone else to open the door. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary when I moved into the old Victorian house. It had been a spontaneous decision, a change of scenery to escape the chaos of city life. The house was charming, with its creaky wooden floors and antique fixtures, but it came with one strange feature: the attic. I remember the first time I opened the attic door. The stairs were narrow, steep, and dust-covered, as though they hadn't been touched in years. But something about the space drew me in, a nagging curiosity I couldn't shake. The attic itself was unremarkable, just a cramped room filled with forgotten furniture and boxes of old books. But tucked away in the farthest corner was an ornate, full-length mirror. Its frame was gilded, adorned with intricate carvings of roses and thorns. The glass was immaculate, not a speck of dust or smudge, as though someone had polished it moments before I arrived. I found it odd, given how neglected the rest of the attic looked. The air around the mirror felt different, heavier somehow, like stepping into a room where someone had just been arguing. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination. At first, I didn't think much of the mirror. It seemed like an interesting antique, though slightly out of place in such an old house. But as the days went by, I started noticing things. It began, subtly, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye as I passed the attic stairs. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, I would hear faint creaks from above, as though someone were pacing back and forth. One evening, while rummaging through the attic, I decided to take a closer look at the mirror. Standing in front of it, I felt an odd sense of unease. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal at first glance, but the longer I looked, the more I felt disconnected. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint delay, a hesitation in my reflection's movements that I couldn't quite put into words. I raised my hand and my reflection followed, but it felt off, like watching a poorly synced video. I shook my head, laughing nervously. "You're imagining things," I muttered, stepping away from the mirror. But as I turned to leave, I thought I saw something. Just for a split second, out of the corner of my eye, my reflection didn't turn with me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. Slowly I turned back toward the mirror. My reflection was perfectly still, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. A chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled backward, tripping over an old trunk. When I scrambled to my feet, the reflection moved again, mimicking my panicked expression, as though nothing had happened. I rushed out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I locked it, though I wasn't sure why. It was just a mirror, I told myself. Just an old, creepy mirror in a dusty attic. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The memory of those unblinking eyes burned in my mind. The creaking started again, louder this time. It wasn't just random groans of the house settling. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps crossing the attic floor. I told myself I was imagining things, that the old house was just playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The creaking continued night after night. It always started faint, like someone shifting their weight above me, but it grew louder as the hours stretched on. By the third night, I had convinced myself it was just an old house settling, until the whispers began. I woke up at 2:13 a.m., jolted out of a restless sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. The whispers were soft, barely audible, but distinct. They came from above, threading through the cracks in the ceiling like smoke. I lay there frozen, my heart thundering in my chest. The whispers weren't in any language I could recognize, just a low, insistent murmur that sent chills racing down my spine. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that I was imagining it, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Against my better judgment, I decided to go upstairs. The attic door loomed at the end of the hallway, its edges glowing faintly as though a light was on inside. I knew I hadn't left it like that. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally so, as though the door itself were alive and breathing. I hesitated, then opened it. The staircase stretched into the dim attic space, the faint golden glow of the mirror spilling across the floor. I climbed the steps slowly, each creak of the wood beneath my feet echoing louder than the last. The mirror stood exactly where I had left it, but the air around it was different now. It felt charged, electric, as if a storm were about to break. The whispers grew louder, swirling in my ears, though I couldn't pinpoint their source. I approached the mirror cautiously, my reflection already staring back at me. The delay was gone, but something about the image felt wrong. It looked like me, but there was a sharpness to the eyes, a depth that wasn't mine. Then I noticed the shadow. It wasn't behind me, it was inside the mirror. A dark shape, indistinct but unmistakable, standing just over my reflection's shoulder. I whipped around, but the attic was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. But my reflection's face was no longer my own. The eyes were darker, the mouth twisted into a cruel smile I hadn't made. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on an old box. The impact knocked the flashlight from my hand, sending it rolling across the floor. In the sudden darkness, the glow from the mirror grew brighter, bathing the attic in an eerie golden light. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, and I saw it, the shadow stepping out of the glass. Its form was fluid, shifting and writhing like smoke, but its eyes were solid, glowing orbs that bore into me with unrelenting malice. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The shadow lunged toward me, and for a moment I thought it would consume me, but then it stopped, hovering inches away as though restrained by some unseen force. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before retreating back into the mirror. The glow dimmed, and the attic fell silent once more. I didn't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually I found the strength to move. I grabbed the flashlight and fled down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. That night, I dreamed of the shadow. It stood in the corner of my bedroom, its glowing eyes watching me as I slept. And when I woke, I found something that made my blood run cold, a handprint, dark and smudged, on the surface of the bedroom mirror. I didn't sleep much after that night. How could I? Every mirror in the house seemed to take on a sinister presence, as if the thing in the attic had spread its influence. I tried to avoid looking into them, but that was easier said than done. The morning after the handprint appeared, I decided to confront the mirror in the attic. It was foolish, I know, but I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched any longer. I needed answers, even if I was too terrified to hear them. The attic felt different when I opened the door, colder, darker, as though the space itself was aware of me. The mirror stood in its corner, as pristine and inviting as ever, but I knew better than to trust its facade. As I approached, I noticed something new. Faint etchings along the gilded frame, patterns that hadn't been there before. They were intricate, almost like runes, but they seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them. I don't know what compelled me to touch the mirror, but the moment my fingertips brushed the glass, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot up my arm. The room around me dimmed, and for a brief second I wasn't alone. In the reflection, my surroundings were the same, except for the figure standing behind me. It was the shadow, but it had taken on a more human form now. Its face was still indistinct, a swirling void where features should be, but its movements were deliberate, almost calculated. It raised a hand, and so did my reflection, though I hadn't moved. Panic surged through me as I tried to pull away, but my hand was stuck to the glass, as if it were fused to it. The shadow's hand moved closer, pressing against the other side of the mirror. A cold, suffocating sensation spread through my chest, and I felt an overwhelming urge to let go, to surrender to whatever it wanted. But then I remembered the handprint on my bedroom mirror. It had left the attic once. It could do so again. If I gave in, it might take more than just my reflection. It might take me. With every ounce of strength I had, I yanked my hand away. The mirror resisted, as though it were alive, but I broke free, stumbling backward and nearly falling down the stairs. The whispers exploded in my head, a cacophony of anger and despair. I fled the attic, slamming the door shut and wedging a chair under the handle. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. I needed to know what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some haunted antique. It was a doorway, a portal to something beyond comprehension. The symbols on the frame had to mean something, and I was determined to find out. I spent the rest of the day researching antique mirrors, occult symbols, anything that might explain what was happening. Most of it was useless folklore and conspiracy theories, but one detail stood out: stories of spiritual traps. These mirrors, according to legend, were crafted to contain entities that could not be destroyed, only imprisoned. But over time, the barriers would weaken, and the entities could manipulate those who came too close. It sounded absurd, but it was the only explanation that fit. The mirror wasn't just haunted, it was holding something, and that something was trying to get out. I knew I couldn't stay in the house much longer, but I couldn't leave the mirror for someone else to stumble upon either. It needed to be destroyed, but every source I found warned against breaking spiritual traps. Breaking the vessel releases what's inside, one text said, and what's inside is far worse than what you can imagine. As night fell, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from every mirror in the house. That night, the house felt alive, pulsating with a sinister energy. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light seemed to carry the weight of something watching, waiting. The whispers from the mirrors were no longer soft murmurs. They were louder, clearer, and they were calling my name. I tried to avoid every reflective surface, but it was impossible. The kitchen window, the bathroom faucet, even the glossy wood of the dining table, it was everywhere. And every time I caught even a glimpse of my reflection, it wasn't entirely me. The shadow had grown stronger. Its presence was no longer confined to the attic mirror. It had seeped into every reflective surface in the house, twisting my image into something grotesque, something not my own. I knew then that I couldn't wait any longer. The mirror in the attic was the source. If I couldn't destroy it, I had to seal it, trap the shadow before it could escape fully. But how? I remembered one of the old texts I'd found online. It spoke of binding rituals, ways to reinforce the barrier that held malevolent entities. It required salt, iron, and, most importantly, intent. Gathering the materials was a blur. I poured salt in a thick line around the base of the attic door, then filled a bowl with water and dropped a rusty iron nail into it. The last step was to create a barrier directly on the mirror, using the iron water to draw the symbols I'd seen on its frame. With shaking hands, I climbed the stairs to the attic one last time. The door groaned as I pushed it open, and the cold hit me like a physical force. The mirror stood in its corner, glowing faintly in the darkness. The shadow was already there, waiting. Its form had solidified even more. A dark, humanoid figure with glowing, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. It didn't move, but I could feel its hunger, its desire to escape. I stepped inside the salt barrier, clutching the bowl of iron water like a lifeline. My breath fogged in the icy air as I dipped my fingers into the liquid and began tracing the symbols onto the glass. The shadow reacted immediately. The mirror trembled, the glow intensifying until it filled the entire attic with blinding light. The whispers turned to screams, deep, guttural cries of rage and desperation. My hands shook as I finished the last symbol, and for a moment everything went still. The air hung heavy and the light dimmed, leaving the attic in near total darkness. Then the shadow lunged. It slammed against the glass with enough force to rattle the entire frame. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, but the symbols held. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and landing hard on the floor. The shadow clawed at the barrier, its movements frantic, almost animalistic. The mirror shuddered violently, but the cracks began to heal, the symbols glowing faintly as they reformed the barrier. I could feel the entity's rage, its frustration, as it was pulled back into the depths of the mirror. With one final, ear-splitting scream, it disappeared. The attic fell silent. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight was gone. The mirror stood in its corner, the surface now dull and lifeless, as though whatever had animated it was no longer there. I left the attic without looking back. The salt barrier and symbols would hold for now, but I knew it wasn't a permanent solution. The mirror needed to be hidden, buried somewhere it could never be found. As I sealed the attic door for the final time, I thought about the warnings in the texts I'd read. Breaking the vessel releases what's inside, they had said, but I hadn't broken it. Not completely, or so I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something. The small vanity mirror on my nightstand, the one I hadn't even thought to cover, had a faint smudge in the corner, a smudge that looked suspiciously like a handprint. I didn't plan on getting lost that day. The woods behind my childhood home were familiar territory, a place where I'd spent countless afternoons exploring as a kid, but something felt different somehow. The air was heavier, the trees seemed taller, darker, and the paths I used to know by heart felt unfamiliar. I'd returned to my hometown to pack up my late parents' belongings, a duty I'd been putting off for months. The old house was a time capsule of memories, but the weight of grief made it suffocating. I needed air, a break, and the woods seemed like the perfect escape. The sun was high when I started my walk, its light filtering through the canopy in golden streaks. I traced my steps along the familiar trails, letting nostalgia guide me. But after an hour or so, I found myself standing at a fork in the path I didn't recognize. The right trail was overgrown, the earth cracked and dry, as though no one had walked it in years. I hesitated, staring down the unfamiliar route. I told myself it was curiosity that made me step forward, but deep down I felt something else, a pull, as if the path was calling me. The further I went, the quieter the woods became. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the air seemed colder, sharper, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't long before I came upon the clearing. At its center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like twisted fingers. Beneath it lay a circle of stones, each one etched with strange symbols I couldn't decipher. The sight stopped me in my tracks. There was something unnatural about the scene, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. But it wasn't just the stones that unsettled me, it was the voice. A faint whisper drifted through the air, soft and indistinct, like the wind carrying secrets. I turned in a slow circle, searching for its source, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the heavy silence. The whisper grew louder. It wasn't coming from around me. It was coming from within the circle of stones. Against every instinct, I stepped closer. The whispers sharpened as I neared the circle, their words becoming clearer. "Help me," they said, over and over again, layered with a desperation that made my chest tighten. I knelt by the stones, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. The moment my fingers brushed the cold surface, the whisper turned into a scream. The world tilted, the ground beneath me lurching as though the forest itself were rejecting me. I stumbled backward, falling hard on the dirt, and the screaming stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For a long moment I sat there, staring at the circle. The whispers were gone, but the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. Then I noticed the trees. The shadows beneath them had grown longer, darker, stretching toward me as though they were alive. That's when I ran. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from that clearing. But no matter how far I went, the forest didn't feel right. The paths twisted and turned in ways I didn't recognize, and the more I ran, the more lost I became. By the time I stopped, the sun was low in the sky, casting the woods in a dim, orange glow. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath, when I heard it again, the whisper. This time it came from behind me, low and insistent. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, between the trees, was a figure. It stood just beyond the edge of the light, its form cloaked in shadow, but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly, watching me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Help me," it whispered, the same words I'd heard in the circle, but this time I wasn't sure it was asking. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure in the shadows. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, the birds silent. It was like the world had frozen in place, all its attention drawn to the glowing eyes watching me from the dark. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The whisper, "Help me," repeated over and over, but it was no longer a plea. It had become something else, something darker, more sinister. I wanted to turn and run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but my feet were glued to the ground. The words echoed in my mind, "Help me," over and over again, but help? How? From what? The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger. It wasn't just standing there, it was inching closer, just enough to make me question whether I was imagining it or not. The more I focused, the more the figure's shape seemed to become clearer. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body shrouded in darkness. But the face was the worst part. It wasn't human. It had the faintest semblance of a person, but its features were wrong, twisted, contorted, as if they were being stretched beyond their limits. I finally found the strength to move, but it wasn't with the intention of running. I had to know what it wanted. The whispers were too insistent, too desperate. They dug into my brain, twisting my thoughts, making my legs move toward the figure, despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. I approached cautiously, each step feeling like it was pulling me deeper into some kind of trance. The air around me grew colder, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing against me. When I reached the figure, it tilted its head ever so slightly, those glowing eyes still fixed on me. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I should have turned and run. I knew that now, but I couldn't. I was too close, too caught in the spell. "Help me!" The voice came again, but this time I realized it wasn't just a voice. It was coming from all around me, from the very trees, from the soil beneath my feet, from the air. It was the forest itself crying out, pleading. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, my hands trembling at my sides. And then it happened. The figure's hands reached out, stretching unnaturally long, the fingers like twisted branches that curled toward me. My mind screamed in protest, but my body refused to listen. Before I knew it, those hands were around my wrist, cold and clammy, pulling me forward. The moment they touched me, I felt a jolt, like electricity running through my body. It wasn't just physical, there was something deeper, something that shook me to my core. I could feel its hunger, an insatiable need that clawed at my soul. I tried to pull away, but it was like trying to escape quicksand. The harder I struggled, the tighter the grip became, the more the darkness around me seemed to grow, to swallow everything whole. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The figure's face, or what was left of it, came into focus, and I saw the horror behind it. It wasn't just asking for help. It was trapping me, pulling me into its world. The glow in its eyes deepened, and in those eyes I saw my own reflection. Distorted, twisted, a grotesque version of myself, pleading for freedom. I felt my breath catch in my throat as everything around me started to spin. The world turned upside down, the trees, the sky, the earth, all swirling together in a vortex of shadows and whispers. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed, my heart racing, my thoughts swirling into chaos. I thought I was going to suffocate, to be consumed by whatever this thing was. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The pressure lifted, the darkness retreated. I was back in the woods, standing in the clearing, the figure gone. The trees were still, the birds were singing again. It was like nothing had happened. I stood there, panting, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. My body was shaking, my mind racing, trying to understand how I had gone from standing in a peaceful forest to whatever that had been. Was it real? Was it a hallucination? But deep down I knew it had been real. The forest had done something to me, and I didn't know how much longer I had before it would come for me again. I don't remember how I got back to the house. 1 minute I was standing in that strange clearing, my chest tight with fear, and the next I was stumbling through the woods, my feet carrying me back to the familiar path that led to my childhood home. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of red and orange, as if the world was trying to wash away the remnants of what had just happened. But I wasn't sure I had escaped. I wasn't sure I had left the forest at all. That night I sat in my parents' old house, staring at the empty walls. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching me. I didn't dare to go back outside, not after what I had seen, but I couldn't stop thinking about the whisper, about the figure. I told myself I was just shaken up, that it had all been some strange, vivid hallucination brought on by stress or the isolation of being back in that old house. But deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong with those woods, something ancient, something dark. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me, the figure's hands reaching toward me, pulling me into that horrible darkness, and then the whisper, "Help me!" I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the more the whisper seemed to echo in my mind, louder and louder. It was calling to me, pulling me back to the woods, to that clearing. I had to go back. I didn't want to, but I couldn't ignore it. The pull was undeniable, like a force I couldn't escape. It felt like the forest was waiting for me, like it was expecting me. The next morning, before the sun had even fully risen, I grabbed a jacket and left the house. The air was cool, the sky overcast, but I didn't care. I had to know what had happened in the woods, what was still lurking there. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. They'd think I was crazy, and part of me still wasn't sure I wasn't. But I had to find answers. As I walked back into the woods, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air was thick with tension, heavier than before, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The path felt longer this time, winding through the forest, as though it had changed, grown unfamiliar again. It wasn't long before I found the clearing. The oak tree stood like a sentinel, its branches stretching into the sky, but this time it felt different, darker, more imposing. The circle of stones was still there, but now they looked even older, covered in moss and dirt, as though time itself had warped them. I stepped closer, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. They weren't just in my mind anymore. They were all around me, coming from the trees, the ground, the air. I knelt by the stones again, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch one of them. This time, the moment my fingers made contact, the world didn't tilt. It shattered. I was no longer standing in the woods. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold, surrounded by an endless expanse of trees. The sky was black, the stars gone, and the only light came from the glow of the figure's eyes. The whisper had turned into a roar now, a cacophony of voices screaming in pain, in fear. They were all around me, trapped in the trees, in the soil, in the very air. It was the forest itself. Its ancient, tortured spirit was alive, and it was calling to me. I spun around, desperate to escape, but the trees were closing in. They were alive, reaching toward me with twisted branches, their gnarled fingers scraping against my skin. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The forest was holding me, trapping me. The figure was there again, standing just beyond my reach, its glowing eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to go on forever. "Help me," it whispered. But this time, I understood. It wasn't asking for help. It was offering it, offering me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure took a step toward me, and I saw its face more clearly now, if you could call it a face. It was a mask of skin stretched thin over bones, its features contorted into a grotesque parody of humanity. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, just an unearthly hiss. I felt a sudden surge of dread, a sense of impending doom, and I knew, deep down, that if I didn't leave now, I would be lost forever. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to turn and run. I ran through the trees, through the darkness, through the howling wind. The whispers followed me, but the figure was gone, its eyes fading into the distance. I didn't stop until I was back at the edge of the forest, the trees now just silhouettes in the distance, and the whispering had ceased. But I knew one thing for sure: the forest had claimed me, and someday it would come back for me. I thought I was safe when I reached the edge of the forest. I thought I could leave it all behind me. Whatever curse or madness had gripped that place. But I soon realized that escaping the forest wasn't as simple as walking away. The woods had marked me, and there was no running from it. For days I tried to live a normal life, tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. I went to work, ate meals, slept in my bed, but something was off. There was a constant unease gnawing at me, a cold shiver that crept up my spine whenever the wind would stir, or the light would dim. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still with me, its presence lingering just outside the periphery of my awareness. It started with the dreams. At first, they were subtle, fleeting glimpses of the forest at night, the dark figure in the shadows, the whispering voices just beyond my reach. But as the days wore on, the dreams grew more vivid, more real. I saw myself walking through the woods again, but this time I wasn't alone. The figure was beside me, its presence a constant weight at my side. It didn't speak, no whispers, but I could feel it, like an oppressive force in the air. The trees closed in around me, the branches reaching down, as if trying to drag me back into the darkness. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that I had been somewhere else, somewhere terrible in those dreams. But every time I opened my eyes, I found myself back in my apartment, safe, or so I thought. It wasn't until I went out one night, just a short trip to the store, that I began to understand the depth of the forest's hold on me. As I walked down the street, I saw a shadow flicker across the sidewalk. It was so quick that I thought I'd imagined it, but then it happened again, just a flash, barely perceptible. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there. It was then that I realized the shadows weren't quite right. They were alive, shifting with an unnatural fluidity. The darkness itself seemed to be creeping in, like it was following me, lurking just out of sight. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. But no matter how fast I walked, the shadows followed. They wrapped around me, pulling at my legs, tugging at my sleeves, as if trying to drag me back into the abyss. By the time I reached my apartment, I was panicked, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I slammed the door behind me, locking it. But even inside, the feeling didn't go away. It was like the darkness had seeped into my soul, and there was no way to escape it. The next morning, when I woke up, I noticed something on my arm. At first, I thought it was just a bruise, a result of stress or exhaustion. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just a bruise. It was a mark, a dark, jagged line running from my wrist up to my elbow. I tried to wash it off, to scrub it away, but it wouldn't budge. The mark stayed, faint but unmistakable, like a brand. And that's when it hit me. The forest hadn't just claimed me, it had marked me. I was never going to escape. That day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think. My mind kept spiraling back to the woods, to that shadowy figure, to the whispering voices. Every corner of my apartment felt like it was closing in on me, like the walls were growing tighter, the air thicker. It wasn't long before the first signs of the true curse appeared. It started with the birds. I don't know why I didn't notice it earlier. I had a few bird feeders outside my window, the kind that attracted all sorts of creatures, sparrows, robins, finches. They'd been part of my routine for years, and I'd never thought twice about them. But now the birds were different. They started showing up in strange numbers, flocking to the window in the early morning hours, staring in at me with those black, empty eyes. The chirping was relentless, a high-pitched, unnatural sound that sent chills down my spine. And then came the tapping. It started softly, almost like a breeze against the glass, but then it grew louder, more frantic. The birds began to peck at the window with an intensity that bordered on violent, their beaks hammering against the glass, as if trying to break through. I couldn't escape them. At night, the shadows in my apartment grew deeper. The corners of the room seemed to stretch out, as though the darkness was consuming everything. And every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them. The eyes, the glowing eyes of the figure, watching me from the edge of the room. I knew I had to go back. I couldn't escape. The figure, the darkness, the curse. It was all pulling me back to where it began. But this time, I wouldn't just be a victim. This time, I would fight. The next night, I returned to the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever waited for me. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I realized something. The shadows were waiting for me, and this time there was no escape. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more I could feel its presence. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, their ancient spirits awakening, hungry for something, or perhaps someone. Wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. But these whispers weren't coming from the trees. They were inside my head, urgent and frantic. "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." I shook my head, trying to block out the voices. They were familiar, like the echo of my own thoughts, twisted and distorted. But I had come too far. There was no turning back now. The curse that had followed me, that mark on my arm, the birds tapping at my window, none of it made sense unless I found the source. The forest itself was calling me, drawing me in, and if I didn't confront whatever it was, I knew I would never find peace. I pushed forward, deeper into the woods, the ground beneath my feet, soft with moss and dead leaves. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the night itself was closing in around me. I felt like I was being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes, and I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread. Finally, I reached the clearing. The oak tree was standing there again, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. The stones that formed the circle were covered in more dirt now, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole, and in the center of the circle, something moved. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure from my dreams, the one that had haunted me for days, stood before me. This time, I saw it more clearly. It was no longer just a shadow in the corner of my vision. It was real, tangible. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that made my stomach churn. Its face was skeletal, the skin stretched taut over its skull, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence. Powerful, oppressive, suffocating. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but before I could say a word, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling my mind with frantic voices. They were all around me, coming from the trees, the ground, the very air. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" The voices were all pleading. They sounded desperate, lost, like they were trapped in this place, and they were calling out to me, begging for release. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized they weren't asking for help in the way I thought. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to drag me down with them. I could feel the pull, the urge to give in, to let the darkness consume me. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged in my chest. My legs shook, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my spine. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting for me to make my choice. And then I understood. The forest didn't want to kill me. It wanted to take me. It wanted me to join it, to become part of its ancient curse, to be bound to the woods forever. It wanted my soul, my essence. I had a choice. I could leave now, break free, and never return. Or I could stay, become part of the darkness that had claimed this forest for centuries. I took a deep breath and backed away from the figure, my feet moving automatically. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but I didn't listen. I turned, my body moving on its own, running toward the edge of the forest. But as I reached the clearing, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I fell hard to the ground, the dirt scraping against my skin. I twisted to look, but there was nothing there, nothing but the darkness. The trees loomed above me, casting long shadows, but I couldn't see what had grabbed me. The whispering voices grew louder, closer now, until it felt like they were inside my skull, pressing against my mind. I pulled myself free, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't escape. The forest had claimed me. I lay there in the dirt, gasping for air, the weight of the forest pressing in on me. And then I heard it, the soft, slithering sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what was following me. But I knew one thing for sure. It was too late. I tried to stand, to move, to escape from the suffocating grasp of the forest, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the ground had suddenly turned to quicksand. each movement dragging me deeper into the earth. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum in the silence of the night. The whispers, those maddening, never-ending whispers, continued to claw at my sanity, growing louder with every passing second. Come back. You belong to us now. The voice wasn't like the others. It was deep, guttural, a dark command that reverberated through the air. It didn't come from the trees or the ground. It came from within me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it only intensified. The very air around me felt thick with an unnatural weight, like the forest itself was alive and closing in around me. And then I felt it. A hand, cold as ice, brush against my shoulder. I froze. The touch was subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't a hand like mine, human and warm. No, this was something else, something ancient and vile. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to see it. But the pressure on my shoulder grew, like fingers digging into my skin, pulling me back into the dark heart of the forest. I struggled, trying to free myself, but it was like fighting against the very earth itself. You should have stayed away, the voice whispered again, this time right next to my ear. You are ours now. You've always been ours. The realization hit me then like a punch to the gut. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, a sentient force that fed on the souls of those who wandered too close. And now it had marked me. I wasn't going to be allowed to leave, but I couldn't accept that. I couldn't let the forest win. I closed my eyes, focusing on the memory of my life before the woods, my family, my friends, the simple joy of waking up every day with the world outside my door. And with that thought, I found the strength to fight. I forced my body to move, pushing against the invisible force that held me down. My legs screamed in protest, but I ignored them. The shadows tried to drag me back, but I refused to give in. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tore myself free from the earth and staggered to my feet. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the branches that reached out to grab me, ignoring the cold fingers that seemed to pull at my clothes. The darkness followed me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The path through the forest was unfamiliar now, as though the woods were shifting around me, rearranging themselves to keep me trapped. But I didn't care. I kept running, my breath ragged in my chest, my legs burning with every step. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. I found myself at the edge of the forest, standing on solid ground once again. The trees no longer loomed above me, and the whispers had faded into silence. I stood there for a long time, panting, my body trembling from the effort. The forest stretched out before me, dark and impenetrable, but I had made it out. At least, that's what I told myself. I thought I had escaped. But as I turned to look back at the trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mark on my arm, the one that had haunted me for so long, was gone. But in its place was something worse. A symbol, a circle, with a jagged line running through it like an eye. And I knew then that I hadn't truly escaped. The forest was still with me. It would always be with me. The curse, the darkness, it had followed me, and it would never let go. The forest will always have its claim. The voice was no longer in my head. It was outside, in the wind, in the trees, in the very air around me. And as I walked away, I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting.